The intelligence community has looked at that point very intently and has not been able to determine that Wuhan had the virus.
And the paper in question, the proximal origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction.
I mean, I have a smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is strong that this was a man-made virus and that it was probably leaked from a lab. My guess is the smoking gun exists somewhere under these heavy redactions. Each of these labs create H5N1 viruses that gain the ability to spread through the air between ferrets.
SARS-1 jumped into humans. It only had 15% of the epidemic changes it needed to become epidemic.
What do you think the chances of all 6 or 7?
I've quantified it because I like statistics, and it's 1 in 1.2 billion. Daszak said, hey, we're gonna shift this over to Wuhan because it'll be cheaper, faster. We'll get a lot more done that way. Barrick says, boy, if U.S. scientists knew this was going on, they would think this is crazy.
Fauci goes to the WHO, asks the WHO to intervene to discredit the lab leak. He then speaks against it multiple times from the podium at the White House. He then does countless media interviews. I mean, my gosh, what show has he not been on? The propaganda involved in the origins of COVID-19 is astounding to me.
So really the hypocrisy of those involved and those who are saying not a laboratory construct, if you want to know who to believe, look at their private statements versus their public statements.
You cashiered $25.2 million in government grants after writing the proximal origin paper, didn't you? $25.2 million in grants. And again, it's Anthony Fauci.
It wasn't because we wrote
Anthony Fauci.
The virus that caused COVID-19 existed in the Wuhan lab before the pandemic, and if not, how could we find that out?
In fact, we don't know. The intelligence community has looked at that point very intently and has not been able to determine that Wuhan had the virus. We don't have the evidence from the Chinese. It's just one of the many things that we're missing that we would like to get from the Chinese government.
Based on the bat coronavirus that we know that researchers in the Wuhan lab are working on, would it have been possible for them to create this virus? Is it possible?
Not from a bat coronavirus. If you take the time to read my written testimony, I'm going to, in that document, I went through a lot of evidence that this virus did not spill over directly from a bat to a human being. It had to go through an intermediate animal. And it's not just the evidence from the non-market. There's other genetic evidence. The bat coronaviruses are viruses that are spread by the gastrointestinal route. For a virus like this to become a respiratory virus is just going to require too many mutations, too many changes for a bat virus to spill directly over to a human being. That could only really happen in nature with replication through an intermediate animal.
So just in the last few minutes, Dr. Garry has told us that this couldn't have come from bats. It had to go through an intermediate host. That may well be true, but arguing against that is they tested 90,000 some odd animals and there is no animal host that's been found. But what he also doesn't tell you is the animal host could be a laboratory animal. It could be passed serially through that, and that's one way of quickly adapting and pushing natural selection to adapt a virus towards humans. Dr. Alina Chan has written extensively about this, how this virus didn't show up clunky and poorly transmissible. This virus showed up immediately very transmissible in humans as if it had been pre-adapted in a lab. Dr. Ebright, Dr. Garry tells us that he's wedded to the scientific method and that he considered all the different possibilities in proximal origins. I know you're a professor, and I'm assuming you've been the senior author on many papers. I assume that you teach your younger researchers what is good scientific method and not good scientific method. In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Garry and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces and editorials. So it was an opinion piece. The authors were stating their opinion, but that opinion was not well-founded. In March of 2020, there was no basis to state that as a conclusion, as opposed to simply being a hypothesis. Moreover, we know that compelling evidence has been presented as a result of congressional inquiry in the House that 4 of the authors of that paper, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Garry, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Rambeau, in their private communications, show clearly that they knew the conclusion that they stated in that article was invalid. So, in terms of what I would tell a younger scientist I would be mentoring, I would tell a younger scientist that you do not state a conclusion without evidence, even in an opinion piece in a scientific journal. And you never, under any circumstances in a scientific journal, state conclusions that you know to be unsound. That represents scientific misconduct. It represents scientific misconduct up to and including fraud. And the paper in question, the proximal origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction. 2 requests, one in 2023 and one in 2024, were submitted by teams of scientists to the journal in question, to the journal editors, asking them to add an editorial expression of concern and to initiate a review for retraction of the article.
I know of no other example in modern scientific history or publications where a publication has come forward pronouncing with such authority that the lab leak is implausible, it is not a laboratory construct, while privately saying, this is no friggin' conspiracy theory, it looks like it did, I'm 90-10, I'm 50-50. But no doubt in the paper. In fact, we know that it went back and forth with Dr. Fauci and with editors who say, we want the statements to be stronger. We want the conclusions to be stronger. That was actually coming from Nature at the time. We want you to doctor it up and even be more strong because we're making a political point here. That's where we should have known we were off track, that these people were politicians and that they were pushing an idea because, as Dr. Collins finally admitted in one of the emails, this is about the business of science with China. This will disturb our relations with China if anybody questions this. Dr. Quay, the idea that this came from the fish market, I thought had been discredited by virtually all of scientists. Now, I'm really surprised it's still being presented here. I know that the Chinese, the CDC, George Gao over there, basically said that they no longer consider it. And actually, if you think about it from their perspective, we're not sure if we can trust them. But at the same time, the Chinese, if they would rather have it come from a lab or the market, I think would choose the market over the lab. If anything, they would be, if we were going to think they were dishonest, would be dishonest towards saying, hey, we found some animals. But if you could review stepwise, just a little bit slower, some of the evidence for why it's not there, the amount of animals tested, the animal handlers compared to SARS-1, but also the idea of this genetic diversity that, when SARS-1 came about the first time, I think it tried hundreds of times because these animal viruses don't infect humans well in the beginning. It tried 100 times over and over again. And even in the end, SARS-1 didn't transmit between humans very well. That's why containment worked. And that's why quarantine worked, because it wasn't very infectious. But go through a little bit, step by step, the evidence of why anybody still maintaining that it came from the market is misguided.
Sure. I mean, let me agree with Dr. Garry about SARS-1 being a spillover, and let me elaborate a little bit. There were 11 cities, 11 markets, 3 different lineages, and a 30 nucleotide difference among the initial cases and patients, which approximates about a year of posterior diversity, as it's called. SARS-2, of course, it's either in one market or it's in no markets. There's no other proposal for a market origin from it. 457 animals were tested in the market. 0 were found to be infected. SARS-1, 92 animals, 100% infected. The vendors, the wildlife vendors in SARS-1 were all infected. We have 10 vendors here. None of them are infected. One vendor had bamboo rats from southern China, where the backbone comes from. He wasn't infected. His animals weren't infected. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. So it really, as Dr. Anderson said, it's one jump from one animal to one human. The most likely place that happens is in a laboratory. And again, to be clear, when you say an animal, it could be a petri dish. It could be animal cells in a petri dish. The question of where the origins came from is the question of where the animal is. And they've tested 96 animals in Nature, and they've tested 0 animals at Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where we need to look.
And I'd encourage anybody viewing this hearing to go online and read the detailed testimony. I think you'll find it very difficult to not come away after reading that we may not have a smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is strong that this was a man-made virus and that it was probably leaked from a lab, probably at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One thing that's convinced me very early on, I've been convinced this quite some time, is just the cover-up. I mean, the fact the Chinese took down data sets. So all of a sudden you couldn't find a smoking gun because it no longer exists, and we'll probably never know that. But also the cover-up here within the U.S. government. I've been doing oversight on our response to COVID, which, by the way, was a miserable failure. We're 4% of the world's population. We apparently experienced 16% of the deaths. We're supposedly the most modern medical system in the world. That's a miserable failure. And so we need to do a lot of oversight, not just on the origin, which is an important aspect of this, but on everything. In terms of the cover-up, my guess is the smoking gun exists somewhere under these heavy redactions. So my suggestion, actually my plea to the chairman, is to issue a subpoena to get these final 50 pages, then maybe we'll get a full extent of the extensive cover-up. Dr. Garry, I don't know, have you ever used the word conspiracy theory as it relates to the lab leak? Have you ever accused people who put that thing forward that they're a bunch of conspiracy theorists?
Not in my public.
Okay, well, I tell you who has, is the chief editor-in-chief of Nature magazine that published the proximal origin. He said, talking about your study, your cover-up, great work. We'll put conspiracy theories about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 to rest. Will you at least admit that people who are raising the possibility of a lab leak were not conspiracy theorists, that they were legitimate concern about gain-of-function research creating this chimeric virus?
Of course, sir. I mean, that would include us at the very beginning.
That's progress. That's progress because, again, an awful lot of people's reputations were ruined by this cover-up. The world learned of two scientific teams, one in University of Wisconsin-Madison, one in the Netherlands, that had apparently said each of these labs created H5N1 viruses that had gained the ability to spread through the air between ferrets. The animal model used to study how flu viruses might behave in humans. That's pretty darn dangerous stuff, right? That is primarily what led to the moratorium on gain of function, correct?
That is correct.
What possible reason is there to be producing what nature probably couldn't produce? Why are we doing this?
It's important to emphasize that the research in question has zero civilian practical applications. Gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens is not used and does not contribute to the development of vaccines and is not used and does not contribute to the development of drugs.
So again, that rationale for all this research is exactly that. In case we have to respond, but that's the rationale. In case we have to respond to a bioweapon attack, okay? We need a defense mechanism. So that's the reason, for example, the Defense Department has spent $42 million or funded EcoHealth Alliance for $42 million and USAID for $53 million, correct?
So the current definition is research that is reasonably anticipated to increase either the transmissibility or the virulence of a potential pandemic pathogen. That research does not contribute to developing countermeasures against potential pandemic pathogens.
That's the rationale they used. The thing they really scared the public on was the 1918 flu pandemic, correct? Even Anthony Fauci has admitted most people who died of the flu pandemic died of pneumonia.
This is a grant by EcoHealth and Peter Daszak. Recall that Peter Daszak is David Moran's BFF. And that grant was denied, but yet it lays out a framework for the development of COVID-19. And you went through 6 or 7 several reasons that are absolutely consistent, that they said they would do X and they did X. And what are the chances of all those things ending up in a COVID virus?
Yeah, well, again, just as a reminder, so they said they were going to go to a particular spot in southern China to get a virus. They were going to make sure that it had diversity from SARS-1 of about 25%. They were going to put it into humanized mice to enhance its ability to recognize the receptor binding domain. They're going to put a furin cleavage site in a very particular spot. You know, out of 13,000 letters in the spike protein, they said in the grant they were going to put it at a spot called the S1, S2 junction. They said, and so all of those were found in SARS-CoV-2. Its nearest neighbor is from the same area. It has a 99% binding affinity for the human receptor. SARS-1 jumped into humans. It only had 15% of the epidemic changes it needed to become epidemic.
What do you think the chances of all 6 or 7?
I've quantified it because I like statistics, and it's 1 in 1.2 billion.
So a 1 in a billion chance all that comes to fruition. There were some comments on that grant in the margin. So Dr. Barrick, North Carolina, developed the technology for the protein spike. He taught Dr. Shi. He gave them humanized mice. Again, this was all funded with USAID grant money as well. What were some of the comments in the margin you think that are significant?
Well, this is important because the folks told DARPA, we're going to do this research in North Carolina under very high safety conditions in the grant. That's what they wrote. The marginal comments in drafts that were only obtained through FOIAs said a different thing. Daszak said, hey, we're gonna shift this over to Wuhan because it'll be cheaper, faster. We'll get a lot more done that way. Barrick says, boy, if U.S. scientists knew this was going on, they would think this is crazy. This is in the marginal comments. So they, in a way, they weren't truthful with DARPA.
Dr. Quay, what's the significance of this ORF8 site?
So ORF8 is a protein that's down near the right-hand side of the virus. It is not in the final virus. It is secreted into the bloodstream, and it does two things. Early in the infection, it blocks interferon expression, so you don't sweat, you don't have a fever, you don't show the symptoms of an infection. And later in the infection, it blocks what's called antigen MHC presentation. So we learned from HIV that a virus that can block the ability of pieces of the virus to be presented to the immune system is a virus that is very hard to make antibodies against, very hard to fight against it. Two master's theses during 2015 that have only been published in Chinese, no papers came from it at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, created a synthetic cloning system for ORF8. Right. So gain-of-function research around things that make viruses asymptomatic and things that make them not be able to make antibodies to are beyond the pale of what Dr. Ebright has said in terms of the civilian use.
A reason there's so much energy around whether it came from a wet market or a lab, in both cases, the action is simple. We should clean up the wet labs, and number two, we should tighten the wet markets, and number two, we should tighten the labs. Please, go ahead, Dr. Quay.
Well, I'll just say briefly, I mean, I think the energy is around the fact that paychecks, salaries, careers are based on continuing gain-of-function research by some of the most vocal people in this debate. And I think if you follow the money, you'll see the answer.
The propaganda involved in the origins of COVID-19 is astounding to me. It recalls the worst of the wartime propaganda in years past when the government would deliberately lie to people. And here that's what they have been doing with COVID-19 and are still doing it. You know, you had this whole cabal led by Dr. Fauci and others who, as soon as the lab leak hypothesis that we now know is a lot more than a hypothesis, as soon as it's mentioned, what did Fauci do? We know because this has all been litigated in a federal district court. In fact, in multiple federal courts. I've got the finding of fact from the court right here. They lay it all out. Fauci goes to the WHO, asks the WHO to intervene to discredit the lab leak. He then speaks against it multiple times from the podium at the White House. He then does countless media interviews. I mean, my gosh, what show has he not been on? He's still on TV, spewing this misinformation, as he would call it. But he did these multiple interviews where he says, no way, no how, lab leak not possible at all. And then he coordinates, and the whole federal government coordinates with the biggest tech companies in the world to suppress, and media companies, to suppress any American who would ask questions about it. It's absolutely disgraceful. Dr. Garry, you were part of this propaganda effort. I mean, you were right at the center of it. It's astounding. You wrote this piece, this Nature magazine piece or whatever it was that we've heard testimony here today, Nature Medicine, March 17th, 2020. We've heard testimony here today from other scientists on the panel that it's basically an opinion piece. You said at the time that definitively SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct, is not a laboratory construct. Of course, our own government, key agencies have concluded otherwise. And on the basis of this, Dr. Fauci and others cited this piece and went out to use it to mobilize our own government to censor people who ask questions about it. People lost their jobs because of this. They lost their jobs, they lost their standing, they were kicked off Facebook, they were kicked off Twitter. Do you regret being part of this effort, this propaganda effort?
Sir, I was simply just writing a paper about our scientific opinions about where this virus came from.
Oh, no, you weren't. You said in an email that we now have that you tried to withhold, but that we have February 2nd, 2020, you wrote, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you can get from the bat virus or one very similar to it to this. I'm quoting you. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. It's stunning. Of course, in the lab, it would be easy.
Well, of course. And I actually figured it out. That's the whole point of that.
You figured it out? You wrote this while you were writing your propaganda piece, while you were writing your paper.
I wrote that somewhere around February 2nd.
It was exactly February 2nd. And you've testified that you were writing your proximal origin paper in early February. So you're saying that, what did it come to you overnight?
There was new data that
came
in.
A revelation from God.
No.
Overnight you concluded,
method.
I got it. I figured it out. And now I can definitively rule out. It's amazing. Is that what happened?
It's just the scientific method.
Oh, it's just science. Oh, it's the scientific method that happened at lightning speed and then was used to propagandize and lie to and shut down. As a scientist who's supposedly supposed to follow facts, do you regret the fact that your work was used to censor your fellow scientists? It was used to censor ordinary Americans who ask questions about the virus? Do you regret that?
When you write a paper, I mean, you get it in the journal. We can't control what happens after.
Oh, I see. So you're not responsible at all. It's amazing. Nobody who is involved in any of this is responsible. Never. Yeah. They're not responsible. Yeah, people have lost their jobs.
Yeah.
People have lost probably their health care associated with their jobs. People have been run out of public, they're not available in polite society. You can't show your face because, my gosh, you question. Yeah. But you don't have anything to do with it. Why are so many of your papers, your other papers, been retracted or subjected to formal expressions of concern?
Yeah, well,
why is that?
There's a long story behind that.
Four of them, right? I mean, you've had in July 26, 2021, Virology retracted a paper of yours. Also in 2021, the Journal of General Virology retracted another of your papers. In March of 2022, an expression of concern was added by an editor of yet another journal to another of your papers. In April 4th of 2024, a third scientific paper of yours was retracted from the Journal of Medical Virology. Yeah. Is this normal?
Those papers didn't come from my lab, but I'm certainly helping.
They're not yours?
They're not mine, no.
Oh, so
I'm
your
on
work
the paper, but they did not come from my lab.
The work that God gave you in a flash of inspiration remains absolutely unimpeachable.
Who you believe does go to character, and so we have to look at some of the statements. Like I say, I've never seen anything like this between public and private statements. So Christian Anderson, early on in this, sends an email to Fauci, and as Fauci says, Bob Garry, and a couple of the other virologists, we think it's inconsistent. This virus, this genetic sequence of COVID is inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So they believed it didn't come from nature. They had looked at this. These are smart people that when they were not looking at it, when they were trying to look at it through an objective lens, concluded one thing until they came to another conclusion that it might hurt the business of science and the arrangements they had going on with China, and concluded opposite. But with Christian Anderson, it's stark because he says, Bob and all these, we all believe it's inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. A week later, Christian Anderson is saying, what I like to use when I talk to the public is, I like to tell them it's consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So he goes from inconsistent to consistent, complete opposite approach within days, maybe even simultaneously as these papers are being written. So really the hypocrisy of those involved and those who are saying not a laboratory construct, if you want to know who to believe, look at their private statements versus their public statements. So we have gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, or gain of function is a real problem. Now, Senator Romney's like, well, why does it matter if there's a chance we should do something? I think he's right. If you believe there's a 1% chance we should do something. But if you think there's a 1% chance, or you want to sort of glad hand people at the end and say, well, we should do something, their argument for the people who think it's not likely to happen is going to be, oh, the administration's already fixed this. It's already done, and all we need is a few little regulatory things. We don't need legislation. We don't need independent oversight. We don't need people looking at this who aren't on the receiving end of the money. This is the whole problem of NIH. The people regulating themselves are getting the money.
So I want to talk about the cover-up again. Dr. Garry, how much have you received in government grants over your career? Do you have any figure in that, a ballpark?
Sir, I'm not sure.
Hundreds of millions?
Back. Not hundreds.
So I have information that between you and Dr. Kirsten Anderson, since 2020, between 2020 and 2022, you received $25.2 million in grants from the NIH.
That's possible.
That's accurate? Okay, so after you write the proximal origin theory, you've been working with Dr. Fauci how many years?
Well, I don't actually work directly with Dr. Fauci.
Well, I mean, you've certainly come to his aid and testified kind of in his support during AIDS. But the fact is, you cashiered $25.2 million in government grants after writing the proximal origin paper, didn't you? $25.2 million in grants. And again, this Anthony Fauci.
It wasn't because we wrote
Anthony
that,
Fauci has let out billions of dollars worth of grants, right? He controls an awful lot of information. Again, the point being, why would they cover it up? January 27, 2020, Dr. Fauci is informed via email that NIAID has been funding coronavirus project in China for the last 5 years. Okay, so he's given, these are the emails that were FOIA'd. They weren't given to us, and they're heavily redacted. January 31st, he starts conversations with Dr. Anderson and et al., Dr. Garry. February 1st, Dr. Fauci emails, and my screen went dead on me here. Rats. Do you have that? Fauci emails his principal deputy director, Hugh Auchenslots. And here's the... He said, Hugh, it is essential that we speak this AM. Keep your cell phone on. I have a conference call at 7:45. Will likely be over at 8:45. Read this paper as well as the email that I will forward to you. You will have tasks today that must be done. Now, that is somebody who's scrambling to cover up his backside for funding dangerous research at the Wuhan lab for 5 years. Is that correct? Dr. Ebright, I'll ask you that question, but in addition, you've basically accused Dr. Garry of scientific misconduct, possibly as serious as fraud. Why don't you address that? Because I would agree with you.
Both on the proximal origin paper, I have signed 2 letters by teams of scientists requesting an editorial review of that paper for retraction for misconduct. And then on 2 of the market papers, there are only 4 published, only 2
but
published.
But again, what was the misconduct okay, so you've accused him, but what was the misconduct The
primary misconduct, the misconduct of highest importance, was stating conclusions the authors knew at the time, contemporaneously, while writing the paper, submitting the paper, and publishing the paper, were untrue. This is the most egregious form of scientific misconduct, publishing a paper where you know the conclusions are untrue.
And of course, the reason we didn't get those emails other than through a court order is that the emails themselves were so unbelievably incriminating.
That is
that
correct.
They thought one thing and wrote the exact other for an article that then was quoted like 5,800 times. I mean, that, again, as Senator Hawley and others have pointed out, destroyed people's careers. They were ridiculed. They were vilified.
Yes.
That is scientific misconduct and fraud. And Dr. Garry, I have to say, if people are bemoaning the fact that people no longer trust science or that we don't trust our federal health agencies, the reason the American public legitimately don't trust scientists and federal health agencies are because of people like you. you bear that responsibility for violating the public's trust.
And the military takes over the WIV in December as well to promote the cover-up. What is the interaction between the Chinese military and the WIV scientists?
Well, so the woman that took over was the one that was most responsible for the response to the SARS-1. And interestingly, if you look at the closest viruses to SARS-CoV-2, so you got RATG13, which is inside the WIV. You've got the Banel viruses from Laos. We know WIV is sampling there. The next one down are two viruses that were collected by the PLA Army and we began studying in 2017. The S2 region of the spike protein is almost identical to those viruses that were originally collected by the PLA Army. The first genetic cluster of patients that had both lineage A, lineage B, were in the PLA hospital 3 kilometers from the WIV.
This hearing is now adjourned.